Hello, we are Francis Street First Church, and we are located in St. Joseph, Missouri. We are concerned about what's going on in the world, beginning with February 24th. Nobody thought and nobody was prepared that anything like this could happen in the 21st century, such a barbaric action that Russia permitted itself attacking another country. And I'm from Russia. I was born in Russia. I was raised in Russia. I'm Russian, but I'm against this war, and I know that many Russians are.
I can say that all the destruction that he's making, into the infrastructure and the cities of Ukraine, should they gain that, they've simply gone in and messed up their own uh, uh, conquering place that they have conquered. Should they be able to do this, um, I don't see why. He thinks that anybody would ever go along with this once it is all revealed to everyone. He can't keep this from his country of Russia, the Russian people, forever. And when they see this destruction, they're going to have to come to some sort of realization within themselves that how can you go in and destroy something when you're trying to save people, when you're trying to save them, but you've gone in and destroyed their whole lives? It's going to be revealed at some point to everyone.
Thank you, Karen. This is a wonderful statement, and thank you for saying that, because Russians are not supporting the war. Of course, some people still so brainwashed. I cannot find another word, but they're brainwashed because they want to believe in their glory. They want to believe that they're a superior nation. It's easy to play on those feelings, but the majority of Russians, they protest, they went out, they have picketing, they have rallies, and they are arrested. So how can the president, who says that he is the father of the nation and he loves his children, arrest his own children on the Sunday of forgiveness? Was March 6th. This is the beginning of Lent, and it is called Sunday of Forgiveness. And on that very Sunday, when people went out on peaceful demonstrations against war, they were arrested and beaten. So tell us today, what makes Putin believe strongly that he has any right over Ukrainian territory?
And I think I'm assuming I'm on. I haven't done this before. I think history is a good place to start. I actually thought the history was I gave you The Master and Margarita, the book, the first time, which is a fascinating look at the underground press and its reaction to the Soviet Union. In the case of Ukraine, to see why Putin thinks he can do this, you really only have to look at Ukraine's history. Arguably, Ukraine has been a Slavic nation from the beginning of time, developed its own religion. It became part of the Tsar's, Russia's, sphere of influence. Only shortly thereafter, in the 1860s, they attempted to repress the intellectuals, the press, the intelligentsia, I guess I should say, almost immediately, and went after them. So when you hear now, let me step back a bit. If you go down to the Dnieper River, the western half was Austrian-Hungarian. The eastern half would have been Russian Slavic, and that's still the split we see right today. Putin will argue that it is NATO encroaching that scares that Russia has to react to, but it's the same. At the end of during the period of World War I, Ukraine tried to get independence and was thwarted. In the 1920s and 30s, Stalin had the same revulsion to the idea that Ukraine would be successful, and that gave gave life to the Red Famine. There was arguably a genocide of Ukrainians. There were millions of Ukrainians were starved to death, and the ones that weren't starved to death, the Ukrainian leadership was taken to gulags, which is what Putin wants to do now, is get rid of the existing leadership and return a leadership that would be in line with Russia's idea of Mother Russia.
So this is what I hear. You said you mentioned two periods in history. One is when Putin believes that Russia created Ukraine. Ukraine was nothing, did not have any economy, did not have any history. So Russia comes and blesses it. That's what I hear. Am I right?
Well, and that's you are exactly right. That's the way he couches this. Putin needs Russia to be afraid of Ukraine.
But Putin tries to show that Ukraine owes it to Russia, Mother Russia, that created this country. And also that's why Russia, in a way, has a right to dictate to Ukrainians whatever they wish. But another period in history you mentioned was the World War II. And that's why I think, well, when you say that Putin wants Russians to believe that Ukraine is dangerous, to show that Ukrainians supported Nazi and collaborated with them. And so he goes into Ukraine with this liberation again idea that he frees the world from another danger of Nazism. Am I right?
Well, that's certainly the argument. The problem with that is that the Ukrainian people only sided with the Nazis because Stalin had killed anywhere from 4 million to 7 million Ukrainians. Right. And then at the end of the war, they were fighting against, one source is familiar with Putin, what he learned from the Arab Spring and the Maidan is there's no retirement plan for dictators. They're taken out to a wall and shot. And so he is up against the wall. He has to, if nothing else, destroy the economy, destroy the building, destroy the people, the infrastructure and the people of Ukraine, just to prove don't mess with me. It's like a rattlesnake that rattles.
It's very convenient for Putin right now to put it all together, history, and kind of twist it. And so I know that Karen and Jennifer maybe have questions about it because the audience probably is just like, what is going on? How could the country suddenly pretend over another country's territory, basing it on some historic moment? So I see that Karen has a question.
At the beginning, you were talking about the history that you knew to be and that you were taught. It was probably not the exact facts of the way that it all came about. History is actually the interpretation of who is writing the book or thinking that through. And we see that so often in our own country. Right now, we're seeing kind of a movement where history is being told in a different way. So, I mean, things that happened, but they are now just trying, the younger generations are trying to just make it the way that they want the history to be. Is that kind of what Putin is doing with his legacy right now? Is he trying to write it the way that he wants to be remembered? I mean, he's age 72. Is he in his egomaniac way trying to make history look favorably upon him?
Well, I think it is, the history is interesting, or the Russian handling history, it is, I would think, the root of George Orwellian thought. If you control the history, you can control what people think. Right now, there's an absolute purge of all the international press is out of Russia. If you were to even say that Russia is at war and you live in Russia, you can go away for 15 years. And so controlling the idea becomes as important as controlling geography. In Ukraine, Putin wants both control of the leadership. I truly think that one part of me thinks he could fly in. He saw the disarray of NATO and thought, I can go in there and the leadership will flee the country, and I'll just take over, and I'll have a strongman government in Ukraine, and that will be an accomplishment. There are tons of people. There are lots of people, conservative people, not just the kleptocrats or the criminal element that's prospered under Putin, but there's a lot of rich people who want Russia to be the Russia of yesterday. Putin's made it very clear. I have nuclear weapons.
I find it interesting you had mentioned the fact that the Russian army isn't quite as powerful as what one would think. Growing up in history class, which I completely failed because it bored me, I remembered the one fact that we never want to go to war with Russia because they have nuclear weapons. But we have them too, so the two countries, if they go head to head, we're going to blow up the whole world because, well, we'll use all of our firepower as well as them. But I think it's important that maybe Americans know that it's not necessarily that bad. I think a lot of people worry that America is going to get involved and we're going to have that nuclear war.
The nuclear standoff was based on MAD, mutual assured destruction. That both sides knew if they fired a missile, it was over. The irony is that for MAD to work, both sides had to be reasonable players. Now, Putin is trying to say, I'm not reasonable anymore. This means everything to me. The threat that I'm surprised I haven't seen more. There was one story, I believe, in the Washington Post. We have roughly the same intercontinental ballistic missiles, but he has spent 10 years investing in tactical nuclear weapons. So they could pinpoint a nuclear bomb and destroy, I think it said, 150 tanks at one time. So he can go nuclear without going all that way. So it's just an amazing, fascinating time. I think.
So what I see that it is greed that is covered by these humanitarian attempts that liberating people. But the truth is, in history, these territories of Donbass and Donetsk were Ukrainian. The population in 1867 was predominantly Ukrainian speakers. But like you said, Mark, that after the war, during Stalin time, it was a genocide when Ukrainians were taken to gulags, shot, murdered, or they had to immigrate. And so Russia forcefully installed Russian speakers in government on many different levels. So now when Russia believes that, but it is a Russian territory, Russian speakers, of course, if you send them and gave them power, they populated over these 70 years and created a Russian-speaking community. But historically, it was not the fact. But also, talking about the greed for oil, for territories, for access to the Black Sea ports. That's why Putin took over Crimea. And then, of course, the access to the Mediterranean Sea and the territory. So what do you think, all of you? Does Putin have any right to enter Ukraine? And what is behind that, besides leaving his name in history?
Well, back to the question or the point Karen raised, what's he thinking, in essence? For a number of years, I covered the courthouse and covered trials. And not occasionally, a few times, the defendant, the person charged with the crime, is surrounded by his defense team, is surrounded by his family. And even if the case was open and shut, the longer the trial took, the more isolated the defendant got. And they became shocked that they lose a trial. And I saw that happen over and over again. So in Putin's case, his circle of friends have narrowed and narrowed and narrowed. And you see pictures now where people are 25 or 30 feet away from him. There's a certain amount of paranoia. And if you think you're going to end up like Gaddafi, you listen to the people that tell you that you're all powerful. And I think that's part of the dynamic. Is how did he think he could get by with that? Well, he thinks he's the smartest man in the world, and unfortunately, he has people on our side of the ocean saying, "Well, he's awfully smart." I don't know. Time will tell on that.
Today, we wanted to talk about who created Putin. Hello, Mark.
How are you?
Good to see you.
I had to wait for my technician to show up.
So, Mark, welcome and congratulations again, and thank you for participating in the rally that we had on Sunday. And so many requests now come to our church for you to continue and having a class on history of Russia, on politics, and also even China, because you are considered to be a professional and also a great source of information on those two countries. We have a topic, who created Putin? Kind of a very challenging topic because like how can he be created, you will say, right? But can you help us to understand who created this man?
Not a challenging topic. It's a fascinating topic. And so I hope to boil it down. I hope I have boiled it down to three names. Anatoly Rokhlin, Anatoly Sobchak, and Boris Berezovsky. And so they are three important players in his life. We actually start with the backdrop that one of Putin's charms is that he's written his own myth and his own story. Very little gets out about him that he didn't create. And so he wrote an autobiography with the help of ghostwriters that presents what he wants people to know about him. He's born in 1951, grew up in Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg. He shapes his history as he was a thug. He was a hooligan. And he goes out of his way to even reenact at different points in different settings fights he had been in. He was a tough guy, unruly, until he was 11 or 12, and he joined Anatoly Rokhlin's judo. It was at that point it was Sambo club, but it became a judo club. And from there, from that group, from that inner circle, how that 10 people that he was around in that club, many of them stayed with him and became part of his he surrounds himself with people that are absolutely loyal to him. So the next stage is he becomes more disciplined because the judo club decides he wants to be in the what will become the KGB, or what was the KGB. Had a little portrait of a founding father of the KGB on his desk. He became dedicated. He went to the KGB when he was still in high school. So what do I have to do? And ultimately, he ends up there. He goes from there to Eastern Europe. Was in Eastern Europe when the Berlin Wall fell. Remarkably, or frequently, he says that was the greatest tragedy, the wall coming down and ultimately the Soviet Union falling. That was the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. From Dresden, he went back to Leningrad, then would become St. Petersburg, and was assigned, at least in most of the stuff I read, was assigned to Anatoly Sobchak, who was a mayor of the city council at that point, became mayor. At one point, Putin became deputy mayor, became in charge of this food program that's still to this day called the food scandal. And so the Soviet Moscow knew the nation was collapsing, so they would allow certain entities to sell off natural resources, oil or lumber or whatever, to raise money. And in the case that I can specify the most about, there's about $92 million worth of contracts. The natural resources were delivered, but the money never made it back to the country. He went to Leningrad, University of Leningrad, to be a lawyer, and yet none of the contracts would stand up in court. And so the argument was that would never have happened. Sobchak ends up fleeing the country with the help of Putin because of not only the investigation but recommendation that charges be brought. And that's when he ends up with Boris Berezovsky. You'll help me, I'm sure, if you think it's that bad off. But he was part of what they call Yeltsin's the family. And indeed, to hear anyone in Russia today say there's corruption in Ukraine, almost every step of the way, Putin was one of the central players in that corruption. For the Yeltsin, the family, the story is Putin didn't charge him a kickback, didn't try to get a bribe from him. And that's how he became part of the family.
When Putin became the president of the newly organized Russia, did the people elect him, or was he just kind of walking into that position by just inheritance of it, or what?
Like that. It's an interesting point because if you look at the people that surrounded him in Dresden, or his inner circle, is largely made up of former KGB officers. That's the core. And so there's one stream of thought, the KGB, and Putin talks about the KGB, the FSB now, they know each other. And they felt absolutely betrayed by Gorbachev and the people in power at the Soviet Union, and felt like they were the people chosen to lead Mother Russia back to what she truly ought to be. Jennifer.
So what exactly is, I think you say KGB?
It started with the Cheka, and that predates all of them. That goes back to the Stalin era. Secret police. They turned into the KGB. There's ostensibly two divisions, internal, international, and then once the Soviet Union fell, became the FSB.
Be very helpful. Thank you. This is very important and a very good question, Jennifer. What is KGB? Because I listened to a podcast with a Russian writer, Akunin, and he brought up a very interesting insight on why it is so dangerous to put in power a person with a KGB background. What he said, help us to understand today. What he said was very interesting. He said the KGB officer or whatever rank, especially the high rank person, is trained to do and like participate in operation. So it's like operational mindset. So he says you cannot put in charge of the country a person with the operational mindset, because KGB officer is ready and trained only to act, not think. And it does not matter how Putin tries to present himself as a thinker, as a philosopher, his mindset, the way he was brought up, does not allow that. Back to this writer Akunin, who said the way he speaks is a very typical speech of a KGB officer, because they are highly trained, very highly trained, to put this fog over a person during the interrogation. So it seems like, do you think that it could be that Putin puts this technique even when he publicly speaks? That's my question. So what is that phenomena, Putin, when he speaks, when he leads, and behind he has this KGB training?
Truth is secondary to the KGB. They decide what is true, and then they just say it over and over and over again. And another little nuance that I think is important is that when we talk about in Russia, it is vertical. But the power is vertical. It goes up to one person. And in this case, of course, it goes up to Putin. He decides what's true and what's not true. And all he has to do is talk long enough and just wear out the opposition. He knows he has a certain group of people. He just has to wear the other out. But the point that I read, I'm trying to think but in Mother Russia, everyone is dedicated to make Russia stronger, to make Russia better, make Mother Russia whole again. And by being vertical, that means then you have to support Putin. Putin, after the 2012 election, where it was really, really close, he only won by, I think, 68% of the vote, which to him was scary. But he said, okay, the election's over now. You have to follow me. There is no room for division. In the United States, we are so much, the United States is a country that believes we are a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. We believe in individual freedoms. That's not the case in Putin's world. It's not the case in the FSB world. They are there to protect Mother Russia. And then that can justify many, many things. It's a different mindset that we have a hard time understanding.
I remember, you know that I'm from Ekaterinburg, which is a hometown of the Yeltsin's family. And I've met Mrs. Yeltsin several times, and I've met their daughter Tatiana Yumasheva, who was a key person in this whole transition of power. And she became the image maker for her father, who had some health issues toward the end. So the question I have, what I've learned, the reasons Yeltsin sort of passed the power, which is unheard of. We did not have election. He simply spoke on TV on December 31st, 1999, that he passes his presidential baton to nobody knew at that time who was Putin. Do you think that led, that kind of a passing of the power gave such huge benefit to Putin? And if it is yes, then how did he manage to keep it for 22 years?
Putin, when he got an entree into the family, that's who he worked on, and there was, we'll protect you. We'll protect your money, the money you have, offshored, and if I become, and so it was a trade-off. You make me president, and I'll make sure you don't end up in prison or worse.
And he is the top guy now. Kind of hard to keep that position all the time, and he's been there way too long, in my opinion. But he's still playing that game, the tough guy on the playground.
He is a powerful dictator that could hold on for a long, long time, or it could be gone tomorrow. Yeah. Because that is the fate of dictators.
Yes.
There is an argument in Iraq that if you got rid of Saddam, there were enough Iraqis who had fled the country, had gone out and become good businessmen with great educations, and that could be a viable democracy. You can't have these raiding tribal parties in Iraq and expect normal people to come back and do it. I think Russia is more stable than that. I think there is enough intelligence there. There's certainly the hunger for a more democratic. That's what Ukraine is threatening. Is we just want a democracy, and no one even talks about whether today's Russia is communist, socialist, is monopolies handed out, and the last time Putin ran, there wasn't any platform. There wasn't, we'll do this or we'll do that. It is, be loyal to me.
Many people, many commentators says Russia is not ready. But when the leader tells his people, and I've heard it many times, right before every election, Putin will say Russia is not ready to produce a strong leader. And so then why don't I continue? So it's like, and people don't have a way to say, wait a second, what's about Boris Nemtsov? He was killed. What about, So it's very easy to say and convince Russians, and also when you have fear factor that don't, stick up your head too high. I grew up, my mother was always saying us, don't stick your head up. It will be chopped off. That's how. I have a question to you. You mentioned democracy and how America, under several presidents, tried to shift the Soviet Union and later Russia onto another governmental style and also social structure. And I remember back in the late 90s with the Library of Congress, it was a very, very significant program, that exchange program between Soviet Union and later Russia, that delegations of scientists and teachers were coming to Russia. And then the main thing was that we were bringing Russians here. And I remember I even translated for a delegation like this in Kansas City when I was already here. And so the idea behind that was it was sponsored by the United States to bring democracy, build democracy. And honestly, it was more like helping Russians to get certain tools to develop democracy. So is it a myth that Russians just simply are not designed for democracy? Because it failed. And I remember how I started the church in Russia. And first I was, the only leader. My signature was, I was a signatory in the bank, because this is how organizations function in Russia. So everything was going through me. But traveling to the United States, I've learned about democracy, and I've learned it should be different. Church should function different. And so later, when our church started splitting, lots of conflicts started over the prison ministry. So one of the leaders came to me and said, when you kept us all in one fist, then we were doing well. As soon as you brought this democracy from America, from the Methodist Church, we started falling apart. So that's my question. Are Russians not designed to have democracy? Is it a myth or this is truth?
I think it's a myth. You'll have to give democracy a fair chance. Putin and those who surround him, who are largely, very many of them are FSB or KGB products, have refashioned. They say they're a sovereign democracy, and then that means there are elections, but he's been very purposeful in giving the executive branch the power to put him in jail, to imprison people that might run against him. So it's a democracy almost like in the communist days. So if you look at either communism, which really transformed very quickly into Stalinism, it was more about protecting Stalin. Now it's more about protecting Putin. There was a vigorous press from the Yeltsin, the end of the Yeltsin rule, and even till even fairly recently, Vigorous Press, they got a hold of a white paper from the Putin camp that laid out, once we're elected, he was appointed in '99, elected. Once he was elected, there were these steps to make it an autocracy, ultimately over a period of time. And they said, oh no, that can't be, that's not right. But each one of those steps have been. I don't think democracy was ever given a chance. One tube of power and he's at the top. When people say, I love Russia, he is big on Russian patriotism, it translates into, I love Putin. I still, of all the different arguments I've heard, I still think it was a combination of the oligarchs and the former KGB/FSB people that came together and took control. I think they thought they were doing it for the right purpose.
But that's what puzzles me, is like how easily people fall into, again, dictatorship. It's like that's what the question was, like, what are we designed Russians for? Dictatorship, that somebody rules over Russians, but also, and that's what I think it links exactly to what is happening now, right? That people are silent. People accept the rulership of one person or a small group, like what you said, oligarchs, so easily. But also, how do you explain that what I read last night, I've read again so much about what Russians are saying. What songs do they sing? Remember our rally? And we had songs that for peace, for unity, for justice, for the right thing to do in this world, for God's thing. But at the same time, what I hear from Russians and even my classmates, it's a patriotism is rising. Patriotism that is Russians are back on the horse. Russians are a strong nation. Russians are standing for justice. And even the saying that Russians are for justice and righteousness and not as Westerners are for the law. And I thought, wait a second, does it mean that we are lawless people? So you see how they manipulate it. So Westerners are for this dry law, but we are for righteousness and for justice. So can you explain it, like what is going on now and why too many Russians are feeling that they are justified? Do they know what's going on or they don't?
I think you at one point you said, why is it so easy to get the Russian people to bend? It's not been that easy. One of the first things he does is his enemies, quite honestly, I think it may have been, I always back to Boris Nesbitt, he was just walking within not that far from the Kremlin and was shot 4 times in the back. Take your enemies or take your opponents, put them in prison, scare them out of being opponents, or kill them. And then you don't have to do that to too many of them. So you had to be very careful. But I think democracies are fragile. And if you see a leader says, if you're against me, you're my enemy, and I can do anything I want to you, that's dangerous. Putin uses that tribalism, and he has consciously either bought off his opposition, terrified his opposition, killed a few of them, put a few more in prison. We've talked about his ability to get into the Yeltsin was through Berezovsky. He ends up being exiled. He ends up being run out of the country. And that sends a message out. So we have to be careful to think that Putin is smart when really he's just intimidating. He's doing everything to hold on to his power, and the people love our country. Even in the most desperate countries, they want to love their country. And so The way to do that is make sure no one says this is not going well for us, and it's not going well. They're not a world power by the fact that their tanks broke down, their food is run out. All they have left is just a bombing beyond recognition big cities.
Mark, this week, how do you see Putin getting any support from other countries? How's China feeling this week? Or are there other countries that would tend to be siding with Putin given the worldwide news and exposure? Are there any out there that are willing to jump on the bandwagon with Putin?
Well, China won't. China may do humanitarian. They may do something. They see a common. The United States is a common obstacle for both. I think they're an enemy for the Russians. I think China sees a much longer path of history, and they see the United States as the challenge. I don't think China wants any part of this. China stays away from military conflict. It ruins their economy. So I think ultimately China may, in some backdoor way, say, "Well, this has gone far enough." That is the one hope. Outside that, you have North Korea, and you have Syria, Belarus. There was some talk the first week that Belarus was going to start sending soldiers in, but that has not materialized. And so it is a very narrow coalition, in part because what Putin is doing is so far over the top that no one wants to get drawn into war crimes.
And only 4 countries, and you named them, signed support. So they voted in support of what Russia is doing. And that was, of course, Belarus, and then Syria, and China, right? And then not China, but a very small country, African country that is very, very violent. And so that's all. So only 4 countries. So why then? Excellent question, Karen. Thank you. Why then, when we have the majority of voices in the world, and people, if you ask them this question, will that make them think that, yes, definitely my country is doing something evil, something not righteous, something that is making us enemies, and also making us as a country starting the war?
And I think that's just the exact way to do it. A gentleman came up at Ukraine, a fellow who'd been a downtown preacher. I'd known for a long time, absolutely stood in support of Ukraine. But he said, well, what makes us right? And I said, well, it's not just us. It's the United Nations, and it's NATO. There is a world of sentiment out there that what Putin is doing is evil. I mean, he's gone beyond. I suppose in the Donbass area, or when they took Crimea, it was quick. Went in. There was little resistance to it, but now he's just. I think he's in a corner, and I think he's going to do even more. You hear commentators suggest that the Russian military is not up to it either. They don't have the heart. They don't want to fight, and so that they are stuck with missiles, and ultimately they may resort either. I even read by Thomas Friedman that Putin may attack a NATO nation just to make this World War III. This is that important to him.
Why would Americans think it owns the high ground? Haven't we bombed other places and innocent people been killed for
that is, what about? What aboutism? Well, the United States has gotten into all these wars. The difference is, I would suggest, Iraq, Saddam invaded a neighbor country. The United States came in undoubtedly because they wanted to protect the oil, but he had invaded another country. We were invited in. A coalition came in. It wasn't the United States alone. It was 23 other countries that supported that and drove Saddam out of Kuwait. And that was the mission. It was done. We got out of there. And then later, the attack on the Twin Towers was based in Afghanistan, but simultaneously, and you can't, I am less trustworthy of the Cheney arguments for Iraq too, but I don't argue with the fact that Saddam had started killing the Kurds, had gassed the Kurds in the north, had turned against his own people in the north. Again, we went in, but with a coalition of many other countries. Then you want to back up. Ironically, there are rules of war. They started in 1042 with the Truce of God, and largely out of the Charlemagne period, and it said you had to be a divine leader. You had to be the supreme leader of a country, not just anybody could call wars. And when you had a war, you can't go after innocents. It has to be warrior against warrior. Thomas Aquinas updated that 200 years later with the standard for just war. And again, it was nations should arm themselves for defense, not for attacking, not for offense. If you are attacked, you can, or think you are going to be attacked, you can address that potential attack. But again, it has to be the supreme. And in Aquinas, it said, if the people don't agree with it, then you can't do it.
So what I hear, Mark, very good questions. Thank you, Jenny. What I hear, Mark, is there are some rules in the war, in any war. But so how would you then interpret what happened on March 19th? If you heard this news, the Ukrainian embassy in Washington, D.C. Placed information that on March 19th, the Russian occupation forces illegally deported 2,389 children from the occupied territories. So they took children and they brought them to Russia from their families. So displacements of civilians, what does it mean? Is it also the rule of war?
There is one more iteration. The Solomonic Code that says even if you attack another nation for any of those reasons, you can't cause more damage. You can't hurt the people that you're trying to save more than not having the war be. And certainly Russia is doing that. And then ultimately it gets into the World Court. History tells us that of the war criminals is you have to win the war before you prosecute anybody. No one's going to do anything to Putin as long as he's in office. There is no mechanism for holding a trial without, if Putin were charged with war crimes. There have been collateral damage. There have been times when civilians have been killed in our wars. But the truth is that before any target is selected by the U.S. military or a coalition military, there are attorneys brought into the question. There has to be every safeguard made to avoid having civilian casualties. So when we talk about civilian casualties, there are going to be civilian casualties in war. And unfortunately, as in the My Lai incident, there were soldiers that went out of line, and then they're prosecuted. So war can be messy, but there is within NATO, within the United Nations, there are levels of ethical questions. The United States, by its doctrine, can't even bomb historic buildings. They have to be cognizant of the infrastructure, and if they bomb some part of the infrastructure that hits the civilian population, it has to be ready to repair it. Has a history in Syria and Grozny of this very behavior of saying civilians don't matter, I can kill as many as I want. And so while I can defend and explain the U.S. protocol and for any kind of attack is measured to protect civilians and civilian property, by the time you've explained that, then they're off on, well, NATO made us do it. They're off on a different argument, whereas the simplest, and I've tried to tell, the shorthand of that is, there's something evil about Putin. He's killed people in his own country. He's killed people in Syria. He is bombing civilian targets primarily in hopes of making Ukraine just collapse under the weight of it.
This is a huge difference because we even heard on the news how Ukrainians placed in large, very huge letters, this is a hospital, children are here. But Russian military is given an order quite opposite. It's like they call it Azov object, and so then they attack. They do know, you're right. And I think that's a difference. When Russians say we are for justice and righteousness, that's not true, because this war is different. And yes, there are rules, but of course, thank you, Mark, because we needed to hear what a person who is a journalist and who studies history and the politics of Russia and knows so much about our presidents and how the relationship between two countries were developing. Sometimes they were up and many times they were down, and Cold War was ended. But still now we are in the middle of something that is so hard to interpret. So we needed your help. We appreciate your time, and I appreciate questions from Karen and Jennifer. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, our audience, those faithful people who watch us and then watch us more during the week. Have a wonderful, wonderful day and this week. God bless you all. Bye.